Warning: viewer discretion is advised. Hi friends, welcome to Meals 10 Alive for, and it's the last week of the month, which means it's a location episode. I'm your host Jody Breton, and if you enjoyed this episode, please like, subscribe, share. I'm on Spotify, YouTube, and TikTok. Thanks. I am super excited to tell you about the location that we have today because we're covering Virginia City in Nevada. If you've never heard about Virginia City, well, then I'm honored because I can't wait to tell you about it. It is one of the oldest towns on the West Coast and it is notoriously haunted. It's been covered by many paranormal investigators, and there's just a lot of history to it. So let me get into it. Now, I can't talk about Virginia City without talking about the Comstock lode because that is the entire reason why Virginia City exists today. The Comstock lode was a silver deposit, which means like a mining operation, and it was extremely profitable. It made millionaires overnight, and when it was discovered in 1859, that's kind of when Virginia City started, and it was originally just a camp and slowly formed into a full-fledged town. There were quite a few very influential people that would come from Virginia City, such as Mark Twain, who was the journalist for the local newspaper. Probably the most famous building in Virginia City to date is the Washoe Club. So the original Washoe Club was open on June 1st, 1875, but only 4 short months later, a fire burned it and most of the town down. So most of the buildings are built after 1875. The club did rebuild and relocated to its current location on September 1876. This new club was even more grandiose than the first and earned the nickname the Millionaires Club. The new and improved club had 3 different stories. The first floor was a saloon, the second floor was for meetings and billiards, and the third floor was an exclusive club room. Now, it's speculated that the third floor was where they'd sneak in ladies of the night from the back for these high earning men, which I don't doubt that. To give you an idea of how high earning, the Washoe Club charged a $150 fee just to be a member, and in today's money, that's about $4,500. As far as the lore of the Washoe Club goes, there are a lot of stories surrounding it. I want to share some of the folklore that I came across, but let me preface this by saying that most of that I could not historically confirm, or sometimes I just completely debunked some of it, but it's still fun to talk about. The only thing that I could historically account for was that the back of the Washoe Club, now called the Crypt, was used to house bodies mainly because of winter and not being able to bury their dead at that time. So if you walk straight to the back of the Washoe Club past the saloon, there is this bricked off area. You can walk back there. It's very cold, very like damp, and that's where they would store the bodies. Mainly, like I said, during winter, it was very difficult to bury the dead because the ground was too hard to dig up. So they would store their dead in there during the winter, and then when the ground thawed, they would bury their dead. So let me tell you about this next folklore story. I thought it was pretty crazy when I first heard it, and I'm just going to jump into it. So the story goes that there was a miner who kept nitroglycerate in his room and also had a pet monkey. And apparently, this monkey escaped its cage and accidentally set off the nitroglycerin, and it basically caused an explosion and killed many people. And this story, I can honestly say I'm pretty sure is debunked, mainly because I could not find any evidence of this happening, and this would have been huge news even at that time. There's no newspaper clippings about it, there's no notice of there being damage to the Washoe Club after the Great Fire of 1875. So I'm pretty confident that this was just a tall tale told among miners that just grew and grew and was just passed down for generations. But I don't think that this was probable or likely that it happened. Now, the rest of these stories are centered around paranormal happenings, and just because I couldn't find evidence of them existing doesn't mean that it didn't happen. So, and they're all more likely stories that very much could have happened, it just wasn't very well documented. So, just keep that in mind. It could be real, it could be fake. But one thing I do think is that the Washoe Club is indeed haunted. So, one of the most interesting things about the Washoe Club is it has a spiral staircase with no support pole in the center. It's actually in Ripley's, believe it or not, because it's the longest staircase with no support. And it's very cool to look at, actually. But one thing that it's also noted for is that there is a lady in blue that seems to appear above or on that staircase, and they call her Lena. So the speculation around Lena is that she was a lady of the night who was maybe snuck into the third floor for these millionaires and she was somehow unalived in some way. Now, we can't confirm or deny that, but that's what most people will say when you ask about Lena. And would we really be surprised if some wealthy men who didn't want to bring attention to themselves or this high society club got rid of a woman who was in the wrong place at the wrong time? I don't think so. I think that that's actually relatively probable. This next one is also pretty probable. So the story goes that a little girl named Gretchen was playing out in the front of the Washoe Club and unfortunately was struck by a horse and carriage. And while she didn't pass away immediately, they brought her into the Washoe Club. Now, at some point, they converted the ballroom of the Washoe Club into an infirmary. So that's where Gretchen was brought, and eventually she passed away. So now it's said that Gretchen in particular likes to hang around the ballroom specifically, but she's not a malevolent spirit. She just likes to say hello to people. Finally, the last folklore that I want to tell you about is a story about Scotty. Now, Scotty was supposedly a bartender down in the Washoe Club and had a room upstairs. And the story goes that Scotty had a son who was a miner, because remember, this was during a mining boom. And unfortunately, he fell down like a cellar of the mine, and Scotty was so consumed by grief that he unalived himself. Let's be honest, too, a lot of hotels and motels have had a lot of suicides, even if they're not mentioned. So this would not surprise me at all. I think that there was many other suicides that people alluded to. There's many other spirits that the tour guides mention when you talk to them. So it's very possible that there are many other people. This was just the folklore that seemed to have been passed down from generation to generation that they still talk about. Now, some people have asked me, do you think that this is all a bunch of hoopla, or do you legitimately think that there are spirits here? I legitimately feel like there are spirits there, and I want to tell you about my experiences that would make me think that. So I've actually been to the Washoe Club twice. The first time I was 19, so this was about 10 years ago. And I remember me and my husband had done this tour. And while I was on the third floor, we were walking around, not doing anything in particular. And I felt someone run their hands through my hair. And there was nobody around me. So I have no explanation for that. But especially if you have long hair, you know that it's a very distinct feeling. I also want to mention that if you are a little bit more sensitive to the feelings and vibes of places, sort of like I am, when you step into the Washoe Club, it's almost like every single room feels a little bit differently. There's a different vibe, especially like when you go into like Scotty's room, there's an intense sadness that takes over you that is just not explainable. So the energy is just off all around there. Now, the more recent time, we went to Virginia City and we took the Washoe tour once again. I again went with my husband, And now we have a 1.5 and a 3-year-old. So they also attended the tour with us. Now, like I said, the vibes and feelings are rather intense throughout the whole thing, but I had some specific experience that happened to our family. So, as I was in the ballroom, I was holding my son's hand on the left side. I was wearing a sundress, and I felt a child walk up and grab the other side of my dress. And it was so prominent that I actually looked down because I thought my husband had put my daughter down and that she had ran over to grab my dress, but there was no one there. But I thought that that was interesting because that was Gretchen's area, so the place where a child was supposed to be. So that was pretty prominent to me. Now, the second experience that I have, we were in what's known as Lucy's room. There is a Victorian mourning doll in one of the rooms. And if you don't know what a Victorian mourning doll is, it's essentially a doll where after a child has passed, they make a doll to look like the child and they use the child's actual hair to memorialize the child that has passed. While in this room, we're all kind of standing up against the doorway. It was a pretty small group, and the tour guide is just talking, and there's an empty corner towards the left. The memorial doll is in the right corner, along with our tour guide. There's nothing in the left corner, and both of my children, without prompting or anything happening, they both start waving towards this other corner that is totally empty and they're both saying hello. There's nothing there. To say that it was a little bit spooky was an understatement. It creeped out our tour guide, and the rest of our group was pretty shocked about it. So I thought that that was pretty crazy. Kids are much more perceptive than I think that the rest of us are, though. So I'm honestly not surprised. Now, I understand that there's no scientific evidence for any of this. You can choose to believe me or not. I just wanted to tell you about my personal experience while I was at the Washoe Club. I would definitely do the tour again, and I would actually love to do an overnight investigation as a more in-depth way of finding out what else is going on there. So I think I'll definitely be back. Now, the other thing is that at the very bottom of the Washoe Club, there is a full running saloon. So I definitely recommend that you guys stop and get a drink. My sister and brother in law were also with us. We all got the different specials, and every single drink was fantastic. So lots and lots of fun. Next, I want to tell you about the suicide table. The suicide table is an old faro bank table from the 1860s, said to possibly be cursed as it is known for the death of at least 3 individuals. Faro or faro bank, in short, is a card game where winning or losing occurs when cards turned up by the dealer or banker match those already exposed on the table. It was extremely popular due to its fast action, easy to learn rules, and better odds than most other games of chance at the time. The first death involved with the suicide table is that of a man known as Black Jake. Around 1861, he purchased a faro table while it was extremely popular, sweeping the country by storm. He had a reputation amongst Virginia City as being a very greedy person, so he figured this would be a great way to make money off of gambling miners in the town, hands over fist. For a while, his plan worked, but eventually, one unknown miner bet everything he had on the game's last hand, and he won $70,000. This was far more than Black Jake could pay and was instantly his financial ruin. Due to this massive loss and not knowing how he would pay the roughly equivalent of 2.7 million in today's money, he stepped back from the table and shot himself in the head in front of all the patrons. The second victim's name would be lost to history, but just a few short years later, the next owner of the same faro table would only live to see one night of gambling as the owner of the new table. He too would suffer massive losses on his first night, with it being unknown whether he too took his life or it was taken by someone he could not pay at the end of the night. The third and final victim would be a successful businessman named Charles Fosgard. He had wanted to reinvest his money and went into gambling. He decided to go to C Street in Virginia City to find one that could accommodate his new passion and tucked away in the rear storeroom of the Delta Saloon, he found the same faro table and purchased it. By this time, faro had been outlawed due to it being too easy to cheat at, so Fosgard converted it into blackjack and went into business. One night at the Delta Saloon, a drunk miner came in making his way to the table and lost over and over again until he had just one thing left to gamble. He bet his gold ring on his finger against a $5 coin and finally won a hand, followed by another and another, continuously winning as a crowd stood by watching the spectacle of someone taking the house. At the end of the game, the miner had won $85,000, or about $3 million today. Fosgard's personal stagecoach and horse team, and his share in a local gold mine. With having lost his entire fortune due to the miner's string of luck, he did the only thing he could think to do, taking out his pistol and ending his life at the table. With this last death, the table had begun to be known as the suicide table, and with superstition beginning to surround it, it was put out of commission until it began to draw attention of the curiosity due to rumors. It was made a feature of the Delta Saloon as the town began to dwindle. As a way to attract visitors, eventually it was restored to its original state as a faro table. It remained at the Delta Saloon until March 11th, 2019, when a gas explosion occurred. Yet the table survived unscathed through the ordeal. Today it now stands across the street in the Delta Saloon's sister location, the Bonanza Saloon, under protective plastic housing, a stark reminder of the dark history that came before it. The last thing that I want to tell you about is the famous murder of Julia Bullitt. Juliet, or Julie Bullitt, was born in London and moved to New Orleans with her family in the late 1830s. In about 1852 or 1853, she moved to California, where she lived in various places until her arrival in 1859 in Virginia City, Nevada. And remember, at this time, this was when the Comstock lode was discovered. So this was at the very beginning of that discovery, so it was probably a good time for her to be at that place at that time. Especially because she was the only woman in the area, she became greatly sought after by the miners, and she quickly took up prostitution. She was described as beautiful, tall, slim brunette with dark eyes and refined in a manner with humorous, witty personality. Now we know that Julia, on January 19th, 1867, went to the Opera House for a show, but she was also kicked out. Let me explain. So back then, if you were a working lady, they had a specific section for you in the Opera House that was shielded by a cloth, so that way the other women wouldn't see you. And Julia decided that she didn't like that. She did not want to sit in that specific box for the working girls. So she was kicked out of the Opera House that day. Julie was found the next morning on January 20th, 1867. She was found by her neighbor who was bringing her breakfast that morning. She was partially naked, strangled, and bludgeoned to death. A little over a year later, John Millen, a French drifter, was arrested and charged with the crime. On April 24th, 1868, he went to the gallows, swearing he was not guilty of having killed Julia, but had only been an accomplice in the theft of her meager belongings. John's hanging was witnessed by author Mark Twain and almost 4,000 other people watching his execution. Now, I'm not sure how they came to the conclusion that John was guilty. It seems that he was in possession of some of her belongings, as her nicer dresses and a few of her nicer jewelry was missing. But other than that, I don't know how they determined that he was guilty. I couldn't find any information on that. Virginia City seems like it was a very crazy place from 1859 up until the mid-1880s, back in its heyday. Now, by the 1880s, it seemed like Virginia City was tanking, mainly because the silver veins were drying up and mining companies went bust. So people began to move out quickly. They went from 25,000 people to just a few hundred people by the early 20th century. Many buildings started to fall into disrepair, dismantle, and whole neighborhoods were left empty. Tourism started back up in the 1930s and 40s, and people were drawn to the Old West vibes. Preservation efforts started in the 1950s and 60s, and by 1961, it was designated as a National Historic Landmark District, which protected many of the old buildings. Today, it's definitely known as a tourist town with its ghost tours and famous Washoe Club. And then on top of that, they have international camel races and outhouse races. So there's a lot of tourism, and there's really only 7 to 800 permanent residents there today. I would definitely recommend stopping by Virginia City as a whole. There's plenty of places to sit down and have a drink, as most of the bars are still in operation today. And as I said, the drinks at the Washoe Club were fantastic. Also, make sure you stop into Grandma's Fudge. Those ladies are so nice every time we go in there, and they really do make the best fudge. As for the meal that I made for Virginia City, I decided to go with a ribeye steak, some baked beans, a homemade biscuit, some roasted veggies, and an apple pie. I just felt like some comfort food would be the best option. I could definitely see some miners eating that back in the day. Probably, it was probably a little bit more fancy than they would have had, but that's okay. Anyway, guys, I hope that you had a great time with me today. I always really enjoy our location episodes. If you enjoyed this episode, please like, subscribe, and share. And I will see you next week for our regular true crime episodes. Thanks, guys. Bye.